Good morning. I have an apology to make because a number of my subscribers were expecting me to be here at 8 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And regrettably, I was distracted and didn't get online in time. So I apologize for that. I am going to do the session now, and so it'll be a little better time for people in the United States, but a little worse time for people in other parts of the world, and I apologize for that. Today I'm going to continue on a reading from Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, edited by Murray Stein and Thomas Arzt. And I'm using the first essay in this series, which is by Dr. Thomas Arzt, as a jumping off place to discuss a number of issues that are happening in our modern time and to give some context for those. And so there have been three parts to this before. This essay began on page 13 of this book, and I'm up to page 20. There are 35 pages in the essay. Actually, more than that. There are actually 39 pages. It goes up to page 39. So this series is going to continue on for quite some time. And this is part 4 of my discussion. I'm on page 20 of Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions. And I'm going to begin with the first full paragraph on page 20. So Dr. Arzt has been talking about the fact that we have a lot of turbulences and chaos in our postmodernity. And his last sentence before this paragraph says, meanwhile, much would be gained if the planetary turbulences of postmodernity could be interpreted as a pregnant phase of initiation, as a rite de passage. So this is our rite of passage into postmodernity. And then here's what he says next. In this sense, future generations would be inclined retrospectively to understand our postmodern era as a phase of negredo, as a time of collective disorientation and confusion, with its attitude toward the world manically oscillating between a Baroque lust for life and an apocalyptic foreboding of death. And so what he's referring to in the negredo here is a step in alchemy. Keeping in mind that Dr. Jung did a lot of research on the topic of alchemy during his lifetime. And alchemy was not the actual search for gold. It was the search for psychological gold and the philosopher's stone, which is enlightenment. And so Dr. Jung explained that in great length in his work. He wrote 3 books specifically about alchemy and what was really going on. And you have to understand that alchemy was happening at a time when the Catholic Church was burning people at the stake if they said anything that was different from the party line. And so the people who were alchemists had to be very careful and circumspect about what they were saying. And so the result of that was that they created this very arcane, mysterious language that nobody could really understand, especially then. Today, there are a lot of us who are familiar with the terms used in alchemy, but in those days, there were very few. And the alchemists were coming up with useful things for the king because, after all, they were trying to find the spirit in nature. That's one of the things that they were doing. And so they were, in effect, early chemists, and they were learning what different substances on the earth could do. And they actually were the beginning of the science of chemistry. But they were doing something else as well, and that was psychology and moving toward a new psychology. And they were very circumspect about that. And so they used a lot of Latin terms that most people weren't educated enough to understand. And so one of these words was negredo, which is, in psychological terms, it would be a time of depression, a time of collective disorientation and confusion. Nobody knows what to do, and there's no clear direction. And so, for example, during the Crusades, there was clear direction. The European Christians were sending armies off to Jerusalem because one good way to keep control of your kingdom was to get all the testosterone that was running around in the kingdom to go to war far away, and then they wouldn't be messing around with your kingdom at home. And so that went on for 200 years and created the Kingdom of Jerusalem between about 1200 and 1400 AD. But when the Crusades sort of ended and people didn't, the men who were involved in the Crusades came back, and people didn't know. Just a moment. So when men were involved in the Crusades came back and they didn't find what they were looking for. Good morning, Lily. I'm sorry to be late, and I'm just beginning. I'm talking about an alchemical term, the negredo. I'm going to read this sentence one more time now that I've explained what it was, and I've just begun. And so this is just the first sentence that I was going into. In this sense, future generations would be inclined retrospectively to understand our postmodern era as a phase of negredo, as a time of collective disorientation and confusion, with its attitude toward the world manically oscillating between a baroque lust for life and an apocalyptic foreboding of death. And so I think all of us have probably felt that at some point. So that was the first sentence that I began with. And here this continues. From Jung's perspective, it is important, though, to face the insecurity and abyss of postmodern life and to accept our spiritual nakedness, as well as the obvious dissolution of traditional belief systems. So each of these sentences has a lot of issues within it. And so let me go through this first. So everybody has to understand that we all have insecurity and we're facing an abyss. And it's very unusual for anybody to be outside that, because we're faced with so much more information than we were in the 16th century. I often talk about my example of the statistic that the average person in the 16th century had as much information in a lifetime as we now receive every Sunday in the New York Times, one edition. And so if you think about that, one edition of the New York Times spread across a whole lifetime was a much slower pace of life. But nowadays, not only do we have the New York Times, that was a statistic from before the commercial internet got going. But now that we have the commercial internet, we're faced with the entire world of information. And it's overwhelming. It's overwhelming for everybody, including people who are educated. I've been lucky to be educated with a law degree and an MBA degree and so on. But, anybody is going to be overwhelmed because even my studies, even my degrees, only touch a little tip of the iceberg of the available information that's around. And so we're all facing chaos, and we don't have a container that we can put our psychological life in and therefore put meaning into what we're doing. So, for example, in the Middle Ages, in the Christian world, people had a container of, the kingdom of heaven and that sort of thing. And so the people who were leading Western culture at that time did smart things. They got people to build cathedrals. And so many of the beautiful cathedrals of Europe were built between, let's say, 1300 and 1600. And so a cathedral traditionally took about 100 years to build. And so people put all of their effort over generations into building that structure because that was on the way to heaven in their way of thinking of it. And they were giving meaning to their lives by building on that cathedral. That gave meaning to what they were doing. But today, we don't have a collective meaning that is helpful to us anymore. So we each have to look at ourselves internally into our unconscious, and we have to start to find meaning in our own life, our own meaning, because it may be different for every person, and it changes over a lifetime. So, for example, at one time in my life, having meaning meant being a military person. And so, there was meaning in my life of trying to get advancement in my career and that sort of thing. And also meaning in terms of defending my country and that sort of thing. But now we look at what's happening around the world, and maybe our meaning isn't going to be in our separation anymore as nation states, but rather as a species. How are we going to survive on this leaky lifeboat that we call Earth? And we all have to find ways to survive, and we have to find ways to survive as a species. And now God has given us the power to destroy ourselves. And so very few people in the world have the power to destroy all life on the planet. And various scientists disagree, but if there were to be between 23 and 100 nuclear explosions in the atmosphere, we would destroy all life on Earth now. And so we need to learn what is going to give us meaning. And so giving us meaning may be for the future the fact that we're all in the same lifeboat, and so we all have to make a contribution to patching our lifeboat up and keeping life going. And so so that's the insecurity and abyss of postmodern life. And our spiritual nakedness has to do with this meaning. So we have to find ways to put meaning into our own life. And so maybe that meaning is finding a way to help patch up our lifeboat so that we don't kill ourselves in the process, our whole species. And not only our species, but every species on Earth. And so the traditional belief systems that were impenetrable until about 1500 have now sort of dissolved, because they were sold as this is the way it is and this is what God does, and he has magical powers that make virgins have children of God, etc. All those myths have now had holes punched in them by the scientific method. And so we need to come up with a new belief system that works for everyone. And so maybe, that one meaning as a collective meaning would be keeping our leaky lifeboat floating while we go on with the future. And so let me just look at a question here. How can we unite with the collective psychic container, but all have different ways? What will be similar for us to work together? So I think I may have just answered that, Vincent. The thing that we need as a species collectively is the work of keeping our lifeboat going. And it's now we know enough as a species to know that there aren't any second choices. The Earth is the only choice that we will have in our lifetime, and for the next probably 10,000 years, that there probably won't be another choice for most of us. Most of us are going to be here. And even if we colonize Mars or a moon on Jupiter or Saturn, for example, that's going to take quite a while, many thousands of years to complete. And most of us in our lifetimes won't see that. And so if we're going to succeed, we have to make this lifeboat work for us and our children. And yes, there will be others who, let's see here, there we go. Just admitting some other panelists here. There will be others who will maybe get to Mars someday and get to Ganymede or whatever moon of the outer solar system. But, even those are only going to be waypoints. And so, we're going to have to go far beyond that, and to get to the next planet that is like Earth in just our galaxy, the Milky Way. My understanding is that at the speed that we can travel, it will take 350,000 years to get there. Okay. And you can do the math on it, but our galaxy is 100,000 light years apart across, and um, and a light year is 6 trillion, or I think it's 6 trillion miles, and so it's a long way to the next um, star system that has a planet like Earth in it. And we haven't found that planet yet, that perfect planet in the Goldilocks zone. And so it's going to take literally probably 10,000 years or more before we identify that place and then work out how we're going to get there. And we have to take baby steps first at the stage we're at. It's like the great apes learned how to build a canoe, and they could go offshore, maybe to a sandbar, and chase down clams. That's about where we are now, and so after that, the great apes had to invent more and more and more things until we had ocean liners and airplanes and that sort of thing, and that took thousands of years. So you can just imagine how long it's going to take us to develop a system that's reliable enough to get us into another galaxy, or not into another galaxy, into another Goldilocks zone, Earth-like planet in this galaxy. And, we may be able to live off Earth, but only very few of us. So the result is that we and our grandchildren, surely, we have to figure out how we're going to patch up this leaky boat. And maybe that is the great meaning. What are we going to contribute to patch up that leaky lifeboat that we live in? And we can all think about that. Okay, so going on now. I've gotten through 2 sentences of this essay. And just for your information, if you leave your video off, and I recommend that you do that because of the nature of the audience here, it will not appear on the YouTube playback, and that might be good for everyone. So I'm in this particular conference, I am not expecting anyone to speak, except maybe for some of my regular followers who live in North America. And this is purely intended as a lecture and a teaching, and I hope it's helpful to you. And thank you for the contribution, Vincent. I really appreciate that. Now, going forward, so we've had the dissolution of our traditional belief systems. Next sentence. An openness to the psyche so that its intimidations, so that it's All right, so an openness to the psyche so that its intimidations can be consciously realized is crucial too. So Dr. Arzt is saying that we have to start studying ourselves internally and find out what it is that provides us with our foundation and what can help us go forward, because the traditional belief systems haven't provided those energies. So we have to find something else that's going to put us on the right direction. And recently I've gone back to the Tarot, and without talking about the Tarot or the I Ching as a divination technique, I want to talk about those methods as an explanation of the things that go on in life. So if we just read it as a sort of a history lesson, that these are the types of things that can happen to you in a life, then you can understand better what might be happening in your own life. And so, divination techniques are all well and good. I did a divination for the President of the United States this morning on Twitter, which distracted me a bit from my duty to be online on time. But what I'm mainly interested in is using the wisdom that's contained in the Tarot and the wisdom that's contained in the I Ching and other divination methods, not for divination, not for sort of psychotherapy light, but for orienting us so that we know where we are in our life. And so if you read one of the hexagrams in the I Ching, for example, it may resonate with you, and it helps you understand, the things that typically happen in life. And so it doesn't need to be predictive. It doesn't need to be psychotherapeutic as these things were historically. It just needs to inform you and give you the wisdom that you need for life. And so I'm going to be exploring that further in coming weeks, particularly on my Monday night class, which is at 8 p.m. Mondays. But first, I have to complete my work with Memory Streams Reflections. So, but that's a coming attraction. So anyway, but that's what we mean by openness to the psyche. We have to start to examine ourselves and understand where we're going. And so the next step here is further, we have to learn how to deal with existential insecurity, uncertainty, and ambivalence, because at the center of anxiety, something may want to speak to us. So this has a number of layers to it. Everyone has insecurity. Everyone has trauma at one time or another. Very common trauma is losing a parent. Okay, a parent dies. And, you were looking to that parent to keep you alive when you were a young child. If your parents weren't there, or somebody who was responsible like a parent, you wouldn't be listening to this conversation. And so when that person is no longer with us in the physical sense, then we have to look to ourselves and find out within ourselves, what is it that they had that they imparted to us that helped us live our lives? What is it like that? And so we need to realize that, everybody has these kinds of insecurities because everybody loses a parent. Most people have some sort of trauma in their lives, no matter who they are. And the irony is that when you have trauma, that's when your psyche can come to your assistance, because it knocks you off your foundation, and it allows something new to emerge. And so I often talk about the movie The Sound of Music. And in that movie, Maria is a novice to become a nun. And she is very depressed and has this very existential spiritual nakedness and insecurity and uncertainty. And so she's talking about that with the Mother Superior, her training nun. And the Mother Superior said, well, whenever God closes a door, he opens a window. And what that means is that something traumatic can happen in your life, but when that happens, that's the time when some new opportunity presents itself. And so we need to be sensitive to those presentments of new opportunity. Um, and And so when he says, because at the center of anxiety, something may want to speak to us. And in Jungian psychology, that which wants to speak to us is our self or our God image, which is the deepest archetype within the unconscious. It also can be referred to as the 2 million-year-old man. That's how Dr. Jung referred to it. But it nowadays, he lived over 60 years ago now, or 60 years ago. And so nowadays we know that this is really a 3.5 billion-year-old man, because all of our ancestors are descended from single-celled organisms, and all of our ancestors all the way back to single-celled organisms did two things successfully. They survived until they reproduced. Those are the two things that were essential for all of our ancestors, every single one of them, without fail. Right? And so, um, and so, um, so there is within us this instinct, these instincts, or primordial information that we don't even consciously think about very much. Sometimes we get them. For example, if you have a sensation of falling out of bed or something like that, that's actually a primordial instinct where our ancestors were living in trees, and of course they would have been asleep. And if they started to fall out of the tree, they needed an instinct to hold on to the branch so they didn't fall out and fall down with the tigers and the snakes. And so that's the kind of primordial instinct I'm talking about. But keep in mind that all of our deep self, our deep unconscious, does most of our life for us, probably 98, 99%, because all of us have a heart that beats 72 times a minute, lungs that breathe 12 times a minute on average, and many other functions, the replacement of our cells and that sort of thing. And all those things are done without us consciously thinking about it. And so this 2 million-year-old man or woman is all that evolution that's locked up in each one of us. And so it's that part of us that wants to speak when we have anxiety. Okay. And so that's the part of us that we have to look for. Now, how do we look for that? Probably the best way is through meditation, to just pull yourself out of the chaos, and just go over in a corner and just sit. Don't look for anything, just sit and wait for some new idea to emerge, and it will, and it does. All right, reading on. If we are in a state of darkness, it is divine darkness. Okay, so Dr. Arzt is saying here that, there are certain parts of us that are sacred, that are outside, that are in the chaos. And we need to understand that the darkness that is within us is part of our nature, but it reacts to our nature, and it reacts to our environment. So if we're in trauma, it will present something new. So as I said about Maria and the Mother Superior, when God closes a door, he opens a window. And this is what she meant, that when something traumatic happens, something new will emerge, and we need to be um, we need to be conscious of that so that we can see it emerging and say, okay, I know what to do next. And, many people don't understand that. And so, they get into a depressed mood and, they'll just go kill themselves or something. And we can't allow that. I mean, we shouldn't allow that about ourselves, because all of us can pull out of it and go on to do something else. This has happened to me probably at least a dozen times that I can speak to. But one of the windows it opened for me was Dr. Jung's work, which has led to this conversation today. So anyway, all right. So if we feel ourselves to be stuck in a state of void, it is a divine void. Okay, so um, you need to be in contact with that part of yourself, and you can't do that with all the noise. And sometimes my father would say, I can't hear myself think. I can't hear myself think. But what he means, that's literally right in a Jungian sense, that you need to be able to pull yourself out of everything that's going on around you and just look at the primordial. And this is why Tibetan Buddhists typically meditate with their eyes open, because they're just totally ignoring everything that's in their physical environment. And so they get to a state of meditation that allows them to not be conscious of anything that's going on around them. And you actually know if someone is a good meditator if they or not, if they say, I need quiet to meditate. Well, I've never needed quiet to meditate, because I'm pretty much in meditation all the time, and I pretty much connect my conscious mind to myself every day, and that's a practice I have. And so when I'm talking to you, I have no idea what I'm saying or what I'm going to say 2 minutes from now. I don't remember what's in the rest of this paragraph, but I have complete trust that myself, my deep unconscious, will present the appropriate thing at the appropriate time. And so it's a question of learning to trust ourselves, because God speaks through us, and he will provide the necessary, or um, we'll hear the necessary. So going on, in a similar point of view, German philosopher Leopold Ziegler considers the state of Western Selbstvergessenheit, forgetting of being, a gestalt of a divine being in abscondus. So what he's saying, he's referring to a German philosopher, but he's saying that the divine being is, we can't touch the divine. Whatever it is, we can't touch it. We can't point to it and say, this is what it is. But what he's saying is that we have to forget our being entirely. We just need to be. And when we forget our being, that's when the divine comes through us particularly. Okay, so within the metaphysical loneliness of modern consciousness, Jung detects a divine providence, or rather an occasion for a renewed experience of spirituality, especially as the living spirit attempts to resurrect from the ruins of the Christian edifice of beliefs. So the Christian approach over 2,000 years was you just have to believe in this. And so, very famously, Dr. Jung said that he couldn't just take somebody else's word for something. He had to actually experience it himself and know that it works. And so he was famously asked, "Do you believe in God?" And he said, "I have no need to believe because I know." And many of you have probably heard me say many times that when I heard that, I too knew. I said, "Wow, I know too, but what is it that I know?" And so it was only by reading Dr. Jung's works that I started to understand what it was that I know. And so let's see. So he goes on, or rather an occasion for a renewed experience of spirituality, especially as the living spirit attempts to resurrect itself. Okay, so we covered that. In this sense, the deconstruction frenzy of the 20th century would be understandable, as Richard Tarnas has pointed out. The 20th century's massive and radical breakdown of so many structures: cultural, philosophical, scientific, religious, moral, artistic, social, economic, political, atomic, ecological. All this suggests a necessary deconstruction prior to a new birth. And so we in the United States are seeing that in great clarity right now, because we have so many of the assumptions that we always made based on the way our society was structured have been challenged by our current president. And so for many people, that seems like he's introducing chaos. And indeed he is. And it's a traumatic experience for the American experiment. But what I know, and Dr. Jung knew, was that from that chaos and from that deconstruction will be something new that emerges that's better than what we had before. And so it's not a question of belief or faith. I simply know that that's what's going to happen. I'm not saying it's going to happen next year or in this decade, but it certainly will happen as we go forward, because it's the only way forward. And keeping in mind that the collective project right now is inevitably to keep our leaky lifeboat afloat. Because if we don't, then we're all dead, and we have the ability to kill everything on the planet. And God will take his experiment somewhere else. So he goes on. If Tarnas has it right, coming generations, hopefully, might perhaps look back one day also on a phase of rubedo. This is another Latin term from alchemy. So might look back one day also on a phase of rubedo, the emergence of a new post-Christian spirituality. And so from the chaos emerges something new. It's like the gestation of a baby. A baby is fertilized in an egg, and in the chaos of the life of a mother who's taking in food randomly from whatever source she has, from that chaos, her body puts those things together in such a perfect order that after 9 months, what emerges is a living human infant, perfectly formed. And so out of that chaos comes this order, out of the chaos of whatever a mother eats, whether it's rice or steak. There is going to be a successful baby at the end of that. And so that's a bringing together of order. And so, all women understand that spirituality because it happens through their physical being. Men have to slow down and think about that more. And so that's the case. Okay, so we have gotten through one paragraph of this essay, and we've been at it for about 50 minutes. I'll see if I can get through another here. So I'm reading from Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, edited by Murray Stein and Thomas Arzt. And I'm reading the first essay in this series. There are currently 4 volumes of this series that have been published, and they're published by Chiron Publications. And so you can get your own copy of the series or of this article. It's not an easy article to understand in this disjointed way. I'm simply using it as talking points to help teach Jungian psychology. But it's, to me, it's probably the most profound piece of writing that I've ever read. And I was totally depressed by the loss of Dr. Thomas Arzt, who wrote it. He died, unfortunately, on Easter Sunday this year, on April the 12th. And so my teaching of his essay is my meager way of offering an In Memoriam to Thomas Arzt. So I'm going to read on now. I'm on page 21 of volume 1. How to continue now. Are we currently living in a historic moment in which all aspects of human existence have to be reconceived and radically put to the test with respect to the secret life of the living spirit? And I don't know if we have to put everything to the test, but we all have to start having a more common vision of what our species means and what our planet means. If we do that, then there will be a spiritual change. In other words, the meaning of our lives can be the survival of our progeny, our grandchildren and great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren 10,000 years from now. Now think about that. Your ancestors, there have been millions of generations of your ancestors going back to single-celled organisms. And every one of them has successfully survived till they reproduced. But going forward, we have to do things that will let our ancestors only 10,000 years from now, which is a very short time, still be alive. And how are we going to do that? Well, one of the things we have to do is we have to recognize that we live in this leaky lifeboat, and we have to keep it patched up. And so you can certainly put meaning into your life by finding ways to keep the lifeboat patched. In medieval times, the cathedral was used for way more things than our church services, for example. In other words, the cathedral was a fortification. It was a place of refuge for livestock. I mean, and in market towns, it was a place for a market to be set up in the cathedral. And it was the main building. It was like the convention center of the local community. And so there were many, many things going on in those cathedrals besides church services. It's only in modern times that we have had this luxury of only using them on Sunday. But for a community like Chartres that's had a cathedral for 700 years, that cathedral has seen many things. It's been used for a field hospital and all kinds of things over the generations. And thankfully, even though we had terrible wars in Europe, those beautiful cathedrals weren't totally destroyed in those wars. And so they also must have served as hospitals in places like that during the wars. Um, so, reading on, support may be offered by Jung's psychological law of energy conservation, stating that if anything of importance is devalued in our conscious life and perishes, so runs the law, there arises a compensation of the in the unconscious. Now, what he's saying is that if we have developed religion, then a compensation for religion emerges in our unconscious, and then it can be brought back out into consciousness. So the example I'm giving of the cathedral, for example, the unconscious presented the spiritual life in the need to build this building as a reverence to God, and that building created a place for many things to happen in a community. And so that excuse of God in the form of the Christian myth has now been largely decimated by the scientific method. But, and so it may look like the spiritual life is gone, but in fact, it's not gone. It's only gone unconscious, and it has to emerge in a different way. And so, as I'm suggesting this morning, that emergence could be in the form of putting patches in our leaky lifeboat. And so, when that spiritual aspect goes into the unconscious, then it emerges in another form. And so instead of building a cathedral, we can all build this lifeboat that we live in. Now, what Jung is saying is that if the archetypal world of spirit gets ignored by a purely materialistic worldview for too long, the former will be subsequently activated by a proportionally high energetic value in the collective unconscious. And so the way we could see that, I mean, there's a lot of examples where if people around the world were to live as Americans, if everybody was to live as Americans currently do, the world would go out of orbit. Okay, it wouldn't be possible because it would just cause too much dislocation and too many wars. I mean, if every poor person in the world were to demand what the wealthiest person in the world has, that demand would lead to too many wars. And so the result is that we have to find a different way. And it means that Americans have to find a different way that isn't quite so, isn't so demanding on the environment and the earth. And others need to work with us to find a way that all can prosper better. So, for example, um, with air pollution, um, the United States has done better things. Japan has done better things. So, for example, in my lifetime, I lived in Japan during high school, and at that time, the air quality in Tokyo was horrible. The vehicles had no catalytic converters, and the result was that we almost never saw the sunshine. I remember those days, and I lived in Japan in the early 60s. In I remember those as being very gray days without too much sunshine at all. Uh, and the reason was something called TY asthma, which stood for Tokyo Yokohama asthma, and that was caused by air pollution. But the Japanese already started to work on the leaky lifeboat back in the 60s. So they began to mandate catalytic converters and stronger rules about how much discharge you could put out into the atmosphere. And so, and there was a trend in the 1970s and 80s to do that in the US. So in California, they instituted very strict air pollution controls because Los Angeles, for example, was having very bad pollution problems at that time. And so what the Japanese did was they said, okay, we want to sell cars to the United States. We're going to have to meet the standards demanded by the United States. So we're going to build cars that meet the highest standard in the US in order, and that will also affect the cars that are operating, vehicles that are operating in Japan. And that's in fact what happened. Now, the irony is that California backed off some of their environmental laws. So they're now nowhere near as strict as they were in those days in the 80s. But the Japanese never backed off. They'd never agreed to back off. So the result is that the air in Tokyo these days is much, much clearer. You can see clear skies almost every day except for weather. Okay, just normal weather, but not air pollution. And so I lived in Japan again for 5 years in the early 1980s, and I never heard TY asthma mentioned in that time, not a single time. But in the early 60s, 62 to 64, it was a topic of conversation always. And you hear my gravelly voice, and I've always had a slight case of asthma. So I'm very familiar with the effect of not having clean air does to you. And so now in places like in Beijing, I've experienced it. In Delhi, I've experienced it. In Mexico City, I've experienced very, very bad pollution. Also in Los Angeles, when I was very young, there was really, really terrible air pollution, and it was not healthy. And so all of us need to look to that issue because we don't get it. We're not getting any more air delivered to to the world. The earth has the air it has, and we must live with it. And so, unless we get hit by another comet, in which case we may all be killed a different way. So we need to preserve what we have. And so let's see, there's a question here. Chloe says, Skip, did you say in the last video that this series will be geared toward young men? No, I'm not saying that this is geared toward young men necessarily, except to the extent that I'm a man, and so I may tend to speak from a masculine point of view. You may have heard me refer to the fact that a very large percentage of the audience of this YouTube channel up until now has been uh, young men between the age of 18 and 44. Why is that? Well, maybe the young women are busy raising children in that age group and don't have the time to watch YouTube videos incessantly like young men do. And so, therefore, there are a lot of young men, but actually, these psychological concepts apply to all people, both men and women. And over the last few months, I have been having more and more uh, women join the subscribership here, and I'm very gratified by that. So um, I think I really don't mean to suggest at all that these messages are only for young men, although young men tend to be thick-headed, and so they probably can use the advice better than young women who tend to recognize the realities of life more clearly than young men do. Um, Young men want to chase after fast cars and boats, and they don't realize that um, the two best days of owning a boat are the day you get it and the day you get rid of it. And in between those 2 days, it's a hole in the water that costs money. And so, which means that they have to work harder in order to support the boat. It's like having a child. And the same is true of fast cars. But young men are slow on the uptake sometimes. And a young woman might be more practical and say, well, we also need a crib and a spare room for the baby, or we're going to have the baby in the room with us. And so let's spend some of that money on cribs and spare rooms and not so much on fast cars, for example. And so, all of us need this advice, but maybe young men need it more than young women. I don't know. I hope that's helpful. Um, so let's see. Arzt goes on. What Jung is saying is that the archetypal world of spirit gets ignored by a purely materialistic worldview for too long. The former will be subsequently activated with a proportionally high energetic value in the collective unconscious. So, what he's saying is that when an archetype of the unconscious is needed, it gets constellated. We say constellated, it means activated. So archetypes are like a phonograph record. Think of a phonograph record in a jukebox. And once you put your quarter in and it starts to play, it doesn't stop until it's over. Okay. And so a perfect example of that is mother. A young woman may have all kinds of ideas about her life and how her life will go. But once that phonograph record of motherhood starts to play, then she's a mother, and she's a mother for the rest of her life. That record will never stop playing. And so also, even going back to the Bhagavad Gita, as some of you know, I've been reading the Bhagavad Gita lately, and it expresses this in Discourse 4, verses 8 and 9, I believe. Let me just go back to that just for a moment. And this is about the activation of an archetype. Here's what is said in this ancient text, which is 2,000 years old, and it probably refers to traditions that were passed down for the last 5,000 years. And so here's what it says. I'm reading from the Bhagavad Gita as translated by R.K. Sharma with Carol Pitts and Les Morgan. Indeed, whenever there is decay of righteousness and growth of unrighteousness, I incarnate myself, O descendant of Bharata. I reincarnate across the ages in order to give protection to the righteous and to destroy the unrighteous for the reinstatement of righteousness. So this I in these two verses is a manifestation of God. It's Vishnu, okay? Except that Vishnu may manifest in the form of a collective, of a country, for example, or a group of sensible people who start to create a priesthood of keeping the leaky lifeboat safe and patching our leaky lifeboat so we don't all drown. And so when people are not doing that sufficiently, then there will be, you can think of it as a god. It's not a manifest physical thing, it's a spiritual thing, but it turns all of our minds toward the leaky lifeboat that we live in, and it tells us that we had better get busy fixing it. And in the United States right now, we have lots of apparent inequity. Our president has a reputation of basically being leading a criminal organization right now, and that is a problem for many of us. And so that iniquity cannot stand. It won't stand. I'm not saying that the president won't be reelected. He might be, because God knows that Americans do stupid things from time to time. But as Winston Churchill said, Americans always do the right thing after trying everything else. So some of my fellow Americans decided to try Donald Trump's version of what the world should look like, and I think a lot of them are regretting it now. And so and they'll regret it even more if we reelect him. But in any case, as those regrets mount up, it's going to change the way America is going forward. And so what these two verses of the Bhagavad Gita are saying is that this archetype will manifest in some form. It may not be one person who has the power of God and can send lightning bolts. It doesn't work that way in the 21st century, but it may be a people or a group of people. For example, our Black community has been suffering iniquity for 400 years. And, finally, and this iniquity has caused manifestations of change many times. In the 1960s, there was the civil rights movement, and that did change things very dramatically. And so things for Black Americans today are considerably better than they were in the 1960s, but they're still not good enough. And that has been manifest by the murder of George Floyd, for example. And so this archetype of what is righteous comes forth again, and has caused the Black Lives Matter movement. And so all those things are happening. They happen in a metaphorical sense, but they're no less real. They're they're just not physical. I mean, you can't you can't touch that archetype, but you can see it in the Black Lives Matter movement. And so that's what we're talking about here. And so that's what Dr. Arzt was talking about. So even for the simple-minded, this should be plausible insofar as the religious impulses of the soul, the anima naturaliter religiosa, cannot merely vanish into thin air. Rather, it will be forced to change locations due to the overdose of modern rationality. So modern rationality has claimed that there is nothing spiritual, but in point of fact, there is something spiritual. That's what this conversation is all about. That's what this lecture is about. And the fact that you are continuing to listen to it at this point means exactly that the spirit is coming through in different ways, modern ways. It will emerge in a different way, but nonetheless, it's coming, and it can't be denied. So going forward, he quotes Jung, I believe. He says, "It may be possible to suppress them, but it cannot alter their nature. And what is suppressed comes up again in another place in altered form, this time loaded with a resentment that makes the otherwise harmless natural impulse our enemy." So that was a quote of Jung. And what he's saying is that after, for example, the civil rights movement in the United States, this impulse for change got suppressed. And so there was some improvement for the Black community, but it wasn't enough. And so then it emerges again, but again with resentment, because our Black community is obviously still very resentful of what's been happening to them, rightfully so. And so let me just make sure I get one participant in here, because she was the reason that I realized my mistake and woke up this morning. And so we can't hold this spirit back, okay? And we can do it, we can suppress it for a time, but it's going to come forth. And so, there are plenty of things that we could talk about where there's been a suppression of civil rights, and okay, you can tamp it down for a time with guns and tanks. I mean, in Portland, Oregon right now, we've had plainclothes federal officers who none of us know what their authority is, who they are, where they came from, but somehow the Trump administration has conjured up some group of federal officers that'll go into a community and intimidate that community. Well, and therefore suppress that community. So in Portland, they're trying to suppress the demonstrations that are going on in the streets of Portland. And that can't stand. Even I won't stand for it, because even though I live 3,000 miles away or 2,500 miles away, that is not the way we do business in the United States. And most of my fellow Americans know that and know that it can't be successful. And even if it is successful, let's suppose that it is successful and they suppress um, those assemblies and those demonstrations, though the people that get suppressed then will have huge resentment, and that will come back, and it will come around and bite him. And so um, I'm fully expecting that our president will be rebuked in this year's election. But if not, he's going to have some sort of giant consequence to all this suppression. It will come back and bite him, absolutely, for sure. And this is what we're talking about. This is the archetype that the Bhagavad Gita was talking about 5,000 years ago. It's not going to change. It can be suppressed, but when iniquity becomes too much, boom, it's going to pop out again somewhere else. That resentment is going to come out, and then change will have to come. And so, the resentment of the 1960s, did cause change. It caused the United States to pull out of the Vietnam War finally, and it also caused the lives of many Black people to get better. Not enough, but at least it caused things to get better. And so that's the nature of human development. We have to, these changes have to be pushed through. If you just go along with it, nothing changes. Okay, so reading on here. Since the archetypal world cannot be suppressed without substantial consequences, and since contemporary society and culture are not able to tackle the actual problems, let alone draw up feasible solutions, it is the individual that ultimately has to face this conflict. So I'll read again Dr. Jung's homily about it's the individual that makes the difference here in a moment. But each one of us has to make the difference. We have to be the change that we want to see in the world. And so you see me giving this talk right now, and I am being the change that I want to see. I want people to understand that these forces are not suppressible, and that ultimately we need to face the fact that we need something that gives meaning to our life, and maybe that meaning is patching up our leaky lifeboat. So I'll just finish this paragraph. Sensible, sensitive, even deranged contemporaries once again have to restore the spiritual anchorage that has been undercut by postmodern categories of interpretation, leading to the ensuing psychological crisis. So we do have a psychological crisis, and that's caused by the fact that all the signposts are down. All cultures have, all cultures are pots. Let's call a culture a pot. And all those culture pots have had holes punched in them from every direction, partially because of the internet. And so, so we do have a psychological crisis in the world in the form of chaotic thinking. We don't know what to do. And so we need to be able to step back from the chaos and see that it is within us the solution. That's what Dr. Jung said. And so let me go back to another of Dr. Jung's books, which is available in many languages, and it's available all over the world. It's an older book. It's called Man and His Symbols by Carl Jung. And he wrote his essay in this book. It's actually essays by Dr. Jung and 10 of his disciples, but he wrote this essay and finished it 10 days before his death. So it was sort of a summation of his thinking. So in the hardbound version of this, which is out of print, but all right, so this is the hardbound version. If I can, I'm going to take off my cloaking here for a minute. All right, so here's the hardbound version, and it's it was completed by him and several of his main disciples 10 days before his death for his essay. And on page 101 of the hardbound version, which you can find in used books on Amazon, and I was able to buy 3 copies for $10. So it's quite possible to get this book in the hardbound version, which is worth having because it has the color plates. As you can see on this page here, it's in color, and that helps in the understanding of the book. But going along with Dr. Arst's point about the individual, here's what Dr. Jung said at the end of his life. As any change must begin somewhere, it is the single individual, that's you, who will experience it and carry it through. The change must indeed begin with an individual. It might be any one of us. Nobody can afford to look around and to wait for somebody else to do what he is loath to do himself. But since nobody else seems to know what to do, it might be worthwhile for each of us to ask himself whether by any chance his or her unconscious may know something that will help us. Certainly the conscious mind seems unable to do anything useful in this respect. Man today is painfully aware of the fact that neither his great religions nor his various philosophies seem to provide him with those powerful animating ideas that would give him the security he needs in the face of the present condition of the world. And he was writing that in 1961, so 60 years ago. So he knew even then this lesson, and so it's not up to somebody else. And so I've done that, and this lecture, which you're now watching, is what I think I need to do and can do to help change the world. And you know, if I may never know whether I'm successful or not. I'm an older fellow, so I don't have so many years to go with this. But I'm telling you that, you know, if you examine yourself, you might find something that you too could do to help patch up our leaky lifeboat. And so I'm making the effort to do these sessions at a specific time on Sunday, but also several times during the week, and with the intention that these ideas get spread around the world. And so far it seems to be working. And I want to give special thanks, by the way, to the individual who wrote to me and asked me what happened, because it woke me up. So I'm sorry, I was just distracted this morning and didn't get online at the appointed time. And so I want to thank you very much for writing to me, and please don't hesitate to do it again if needed. But I'll do my best. It's a bit embarrassing to have that happen, but I hope this has been helpful. I'm going to stop for today because we have been going for over an hour and a half, And so I thank you for being here today. And I will be continuing on every Sunday morning at 8 a.m. my time, uh, so that we can have these discussions going forward. And I intend to go through Dr. Arst's entire essay. I'm on page 21 of it, and it has 39, it goes to page 39. So we still have another 18 pages, and I managed to get through a page and a half today. So there are going to be many more parts to this. And so I've been reading from Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, edited by Murray Stein and Thomas Arzt as editors. And I'm reading from Thomas Arst's first essay in the series of 4 volumes entitled The Way of What Is to Come, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions. And it's published by Chiron Publications. That's Chiron, Chiron Publications. They publish a wide variety of very excellent books. Yesterday, for BTS fans, yesterday I received this book, Map of the Soul 7, Persona, Shadow, and what's the last word? Persona, Shadow, and Ego in the World of BTS. And so this is by Murray Stein, who's also the editor of the series that I've been reading from. And in this book, Murray Stein is actually giving a psychological analysis of many of the tracks of a couple of albums of the BTS oeuvre. I guess it's mainly Map of the Soul, or I'm sorry, it's both Map of the Soul 7 and Map of the Soul Persona, where he's gone through every song on those 2 albums and discussed it from a psychological basis. So that's Map of the Soul 7, Persona, Shadow, and Ego in the World of BTS by Murray Stein, with Stephen Busser and Leonard Cruz. Stephen Busser and Leonard Cruz are the 2 gentlemen that purchased Chiron Publication from Murray Stein. And we will be interviewing Dr. Murray Stein in our Wisdom Path Global Check-in on Sunday, the 9th of August at 1 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time. I'm sorry for my friends in Singapore, that'll be 1 a.m. your time. And so it's going to be a hard time to attend live, but if you're so moved, you can do that. And so we have Dr. Murray Stein on the 9th of August, and on the 26th of July, a week from today at 1 p.m., we will have Dr. Anne Ulanoff, who is a very famous and well-known Jungian analyst. She has written at least 17 books, to my knowledge, by herself, and another 6 with her husband, Barry Ulanoff. And she's going to be talking about her essay in the same series. And her essay is called Blundering into the Work of Redemption. And we all need redemption because we all fail the world in some way. And so what Dr. Ulanoff is going to be talking about is how we redeem ourselves when things go badly. And so that'll be a valuable conversation as well. It's called Blundering into the Work of Redemption. And she's specifically in the essay talking about how Dr. Jung did his work of redemption after he split off from Dr. Freud. But I've asked her to also talk about it in generic terms. And Dr. Ulanoff is the retired emerita professor of psychiatry and religion at Union Theological Seminary. So she is very much talking about the fundamental idea that Dr. Jung had, that religions are a naturally evolved form of psychotherapy. And they've always provided that functionality up until the beginning of the 20th century, when Doctors Freud and Jung turned it into an actual profession. But before that, it was the priest or the minister or the rabbi or the mullah or the priest in Hinduism, let's say, who or the lama, who were the psychotherapists and who helped people through their troubles. And so they will be speaking. And also this Tuesday at 1 p.m. On July the 21st, or I'm sorry, it's at 2 p.m. At 2 p.m. this coming Tuesday, we have Dr. John Jackson, who was a psychiatrist for 40 years in California, who is going to speak to us about the women of the Old Testament. And I'm putting my email address on the chat on the YouTube channel. Let me put it on the Zoom as well. And so if you want to participate in those sessions and you need a schedule and the appropriate links and passwords, please write to me at the email address I've provided here, and which is skip.conover@gmail.com. And I will send you a schedule and with all the links so that you can join us on those days. So thank you for joining me today, and I very much appreciate your participation. Let's see, there's one other comment here. Empowered Imagination says, beautiful Tibetan tanka on man and his symbols. Thank you for showing us. Yes, and that references to this mandala. It's actually a Tibetan mandala that appears on the cover of Man and His Symbols, and on the hardbound edition, which you should get in used books on Amazon. And Dr. Jung felt very much that the Tibetan Buddhists had created a technology of the psyche that was closest to what his psychology was doing. And so if you go back and look at the earlier videos of Dr. Jung, which are on YouTube, they're available on YouTube. There are two of them that are very good interviews. And in those interviews, you'll see a tour of his house at one point, and you'll see that he had two beautiful Tibetan Buddhist tankas in his living spaces in his home in Switzerland. And he actually created a tanka, or he created a mandala that appears in the Red Book. And I think most of you know that, but if you don't know it, I urge you to do a Google search on Red Book photos or Red Book images or something like that. And you can get all the pictures that Dr. Jung painted that appear in his Red Book. And it's, it's quite a valuable document if you can get one. It, uh, this is it, and you can see how large it is. I'm having trouble holding it up. and it is available on Amazon. I hope it becomes available at a little lower price, but there is a reader's edition to the Red Book, which is here. It's a smaller edition. This copy, it has only the words in it, but it is only $25 also. So it has that benefit, and it has been translated into quite a number of languages. I know from my friend in Brazil that it is available in Portuguese, for example, and it's available in many languages now. And so you probably can get it in your own language. And I know it's even being translated into Chinese as we speak. So anyway, thank you very much for joining me today. And I'll look forward to seeing you again next Sunday. Next week, I will endeavor not to be so late in getting going. But if I should forget again, please send me a nastygram and remind me so that I can come online. And I do apologize for being late today. So thank you very much. Peace to everybody.